Thank you. David Steiner.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Roosevelt House. It's a great pleasure to invite those of you who have not been here before to this extraordinary house, which of course was FDR's house before he became president. He lived with two powerful women who had their differences, his wife and, of course, his mother, Sarah. They had a relationship which was defined by the architecture of the house. It was originally a place in which one lady could interrupt the life of another with great ease by moving across a Chinese wall that we've knocked down to make this beautiful space. We are delighted to have this event as one of a number of launch events for the Institute and to co-host it with our partners, who I'll speak of in a moment, the Research Alliance for New York Public Schools. In May, we will have the official launch in our own right of the CUNY Institute for Education Policy. The Institute was set up by a vote of the Board of Trustees of CUNY and with the extraordinary support of Matt Goldstein and with Jennifer Rabb, the president of Hunter's support for giving us access to this wonderful house. We hope to make the Institute a go-to place for non-aligned debate, research, discussion, publications around issues of public education, pre-K through 20. We feel that there should be a real home for such debate in the nation's largest urban public university. We are talking about, after all, a university where if you put the full-time and part-time students together, we're speaking of some 500,000 young people studying at CUNY, and that is a remarkable number. We should be a place for informed debate about public education. And tonight is an example of just that kind of discussion. I want to thank our partners at the Research Alliance. You'll hear shortly from Jim Kemple, Tom Gold, Chelsea Farley. I want to thank our colleagues at Roosevelt House who always work so hard to make these events work. Jonathan Fanton, the acting director, Faye Rosenfeld, Cindy Pierre-Noel. We want also to note my own small and therefore largely overworked staff, Peter Mayer, who's at the back, and Daniel Reed, who you saw at the entrance, and Lily Rabe, who helps us with all of the many logistical details. I do want to say that it is a particular pleasure to co-host the event with the Research Alliance for New York City Schools. As many of you know, they are a group of scholars drawn from a number of universities, primarily NYU and Columbia, who by agreement have access to data from the New York City public schools. The agreement is quite simple. There is no censorship. The Research Alliance can do with that data what they will, make what reports they will. The only condition is that the New York City public schools see that data as analyzed by our colleagues prior to a public release such as tonight. Dr. Jim Kemple, who will present the report and the research, has an extraordinary career starting, as won't surprise you when you hear him, as a high school math teacher. He is a wonderful communicator. He's become, since then, a leading figure in education research. He spent 18 years at MDRC, where he was director of K-12 education policy, and served as the principal investigator for many major studies of high school interventions. 3 years ago, when the Research Alliance was looking for its first executive director, Jim was the obvious choice. It is a great pleasure to welcome Jim Kemple to the podium to give the research report.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Welcome, and thank you all for coming out on a Wednesday night to hear, I think, probably a data blizzard rather than a snow blizzard. I'm going to present a lot of information tonight, but all of this will be made available tomorrow online as we post the report from a series of analyses we've been conducting, trying to understand the dynamics, the structure, the landscape, and the outcomes from New York City's public high schools. So tonight I'm going to try to run through some of the basic findings that are included in the report. Following up on the report, there'll also be a set of data tables that'll be made available publicly and posted online that provide many, many more details than even the paper can include. So let me just dive right into this and try to cut to the chase with some of the background and then key findings from our analysis. This is one in a series of papers that the Research Alliance is in the midst of producing, aimed at trying to inform future education policies for high schools in New York City. We want to be clear that our effort here is really not to draw definitive conclusions about the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of New York City's reform efforts over the last 10 to 12 years. Although certainly in taking stock and mapping trends over time, inevitably there'll be some of that. But our effort is really a forward-looking one, where we really would like to make sure that we are putting policymakers and practitioners in a better position to make informed decisions about how to make good use of public resources for the benefit of children in New York City. This particular paper sets the stage with some descriptive information. It was intended always to be a paper that would lay some foundational indicators and map some indicating trends, but always with the idea of raising at least as many, if not more, questions than it was going to attempt to answer. Somehow this took on more of a life of its own and has, even before we finished this, really started to get some more legs underneath it than I think I had ever expected or intended as it done. I thought it was only in big Irish families like mine where everybody started eating before the table was set, but that seems to have been the case here. The other papers in the series are going to tackle a range of issues having to do with measurement, having to do with the impact of specific features of the reforms, understanding the variation. Tonight we'll talk mostly about overall averages, but I think much of the story in New York City, given its diversity, lies underneath averages and lies in the variation that we see across schools, across communities, and across subpopulations of students. And we'll be mapping those trends and trying to understand what it will take to help young people make healthy transitions into a post-secondary world of education, of work, and of healthy development moving forward as adults. So tonight my presentation is going to focus on findings from our analysis that includes almost 900,000 young people who enrolled in 469 different high schools over a 12-year period between September of 1999 and September of 2000. We're going to focus here exclusively on students who entered the New York City high schools for the first time as a 9th grader. What we won't include here are young people who entered from outside the system after the 9th grade. And so some of the numbers that you see may differ slightly from what you may have seen published by the New York State Education Department or the Department of Education because of the fact that we're only looking at this population of young people who began as first-time 9th graders, largely so we could map them over the full 4 years of high school and look at cumulative outcomes for those people. We have started to look at the young people who've transferred in later on in their careers, but tonight I'll focus on the first-time 9th graders. As I said, we're going to follow students out through their scheduled graduation from high school 4 years after starting, and our calculations of things like graduation rates are very consistent with and using the methods that are used by the New York State Education Department to include students, for example, who earn diplomas during the summer, and counting the graduation and diplomas in much the same way that the New York State Education Department does. So let me start with just sort of mapping the landscape a bit for you. So we're talking here about a massive transformation in the stock of schools for the New York City public high school landscape. In 1999, the first year that we begin following them, we find 212 schools that enrolled first-time 9th graders. 5 of those were specialized exam high schools. 186 were general and vocational education or vocational education high schools, and there were still 21 junior high schools, typically enrolling students in grades 7 through 9 or 6 through 9, but ending before students began in the 10th grade. By 2010, that number of schools has nearly doubled to 409. With 4 additional specialized high schools, 148 of the original group of 186 had operated continuously throughout this 12-year period. And there are now 251 new high schools. and 1 remaining junior high school. So over that 12 years, we see 38 of the original high schools being phased out, 20 of the original junior high schools no longer enrolling 9th graders, and 2 of these new schools subsequently being phased out by 2010. This gives you a little sense of how that landscape has shifted. So as the number of schools has nearly doubled over this 12-year period, the number of new 9th graders that are being admitted to these schools each year has been cut nearly in half. So we see the number of high schools growing from about 212 to 409, while the average number of new 9th graders being admitted to those schools falls from 344 to 178. And in fact, by 2010, almost 35% of students are enrolled in high schools that enroll 110 new 9th graders per year or fewer. And of the 251 schools that had opened as brand new schools, almost all of those are enrolling fewer than 200 students as an entering 9th grade class. So a radical shift in the way that we've configured high schools. So what do we see in the way of progress? And let me dive right into the trends in student outcomes. And I want to focus on sort of, as a way to summarize the overall results discussed in the paper, think about 3 key points in young people's careers, or 3 key indicators about their progress at the stages of their schooling careers. 1, in 9th grade, are they getting on track to graduation? And secondly, are they actually graduating, and in this case with a Regents diploma? And thirdly, are they graduating with the kinds of credentials that suggest that they would be ready for college level work? And all 3 of those indicators, as I'll show you in a graph in a second, we've seen significant progress among the students attending New York City public high schools. And I'm going to focus primarily on the period of 2001 through 2007. And I'm marking those years by the year in which young people entered high school. So 2001 marks September of that year, when that group of first-time 9th graders entered high schools in New York City. 2007 marks the group of young people who were entering high school in September of 2007 and scheduled to graduate in 2011. So we follow the 2001 cohort through 2005, or 2004, and we follow 2007 through 2011. I'm sorry, 2001 to 2005. Okay? And what we see here are significant progress at the on-track rates, where we see between 2001 and 2007 a 28% increase in being on track for graduation. That's a group that we can look at more 9th grade cohorts out through 2011, and we see that continues to grow as a leading indicator. And this on-track indicator is a prediction which we have documented empirically in another paper published recently in an academic journal about the predictive validity of an on-track indicator, which in this case it's marked by students earning a minimum of 10 credits in their 9th grade year and passing at least 1 New York State Regents exam. And when we look at that indicator, there's a very, very high correlation between young people meeting that on-track benchmark and subsequently graduating 4 years later. And we see that by the 2011 cohort we've seen a 50% increase from the 2001 cohort, which suggests that the improvements in graduation rates that I'll show in a minute should continue on into the next 3 or 4 years at least. Students are staying on track longer and earning their Regents diplomas, with a 64% growth in that indicator between the 2001 and 2007 cohorts, and more of those students are graduating with a college-ready credential. And I want to be clear in this case that the college-ready credential we're talking about is virtually the same as what the state now calls the aspirational performance measure, which is indicated by students earning at least an 80 on a New York State Regents mathematics examination and at least a 75 on the New York State English Regents examination. And so when we combine those 2 additional benchmarks with the fact that they've earned a Regents diploma, we mark that in this case, as a college-ready indicator. And I think one of the things I want to refer to throughout this is that this college-ready indicator is something we know least about research-wise in terms of its validity at predicting longer-term outcomes for young people as they move into college and particularly in careers. So this is kind of a preliminary indicator, but it's the one that the state typically uses. Yet we still see an aspirations gap where we see that depending on the year, it fluctuates between 56 and 64% of the young people who earn a Regents diploma do not meet this aspirational performance standard based on their math and English Regents exams. So although we've seen significant improvement, we still see a gap between their aspirational, this aspirational indicator. So let me show you what that looks like graphically. This line here shows you the percentage of young people who at the end of their 9th grade would be indicated as on track for graduation, having earned those 10 credits out of 44 to graduate and passed at least one Regents exam. And we see, as you see, after a small dip in the early 2000s, we see a consistent and steady increase over time, so that by the 2007 cohort, fully 53% of those students are on track, and it continues to grow out to 62%. And the other analysis that the Research Alliance has done shows that that relationship has remained quite constant between graduation and on track, so that if that continues to happen, we do expect to see some increases in graduation rate beyond the cohort that we can currently measure. These are the graduation rates. So the blue bars indicate students earning a Regents diploma with advanced standing. The yellow bars indicate students earning a Regents diploma but not with advanced standing, and the pink pieces of the bars are local diplomas, which have been phased out over the last 5 years so that students who are currently graduating from high school must earn a Regents diploma in order to be counted as New York City and New York State graduates. And what we see here is a steady increase in the graduation rates overall. Most of that, almost all of that, is being driven by an increase in the young people earning Regents examinations, not local diplomas. And so that we see a greater and greater proportion of graduates earning Regents diplomas. And the largest increase, as you can see, given the increase in the yellow bars, is occurring among young people who are earning Regents Regents diplomas that are not with advanced standing. And the third indicator, as I mentioned, is this aspirational performance measure for college readiness, which also shows steady increases. Interestingly, given the small level at the outset of this follow-up period to the 2001 cohort, the improvement from 2001 to 2007 was 61%, taking the difference between those two and dividing it by 13, we see a 61% increase. Even though the line looks like it's a little bit shallower, but starting with that lower denominator. But the point I want to make with those two comparisons is that as a proportion of the young people earning a Regents diploma, that aspirational performance measure has stayed pretty constant at about 36% to 40% of young people who have earned a Regents diploma are earning a Regents diploma with this additional aspirational performance criteria with their Regents, the math and Regents examinations. So we've seen some growth, but this continued wide gap between actually graduating with a diploma and having this aspirational performance measure. I also want to show very quickly that some have criticized or suspected that perhaps this increase in graduation rates is an artifact of the way that it's calculated. New York State, as some of you know, and New York City calculates their graduation rates on the basis of young people who do not transfer out of the New York City public school system. And there has been some contention that perhaps students who are actually dropouts are being classified as transfers, which means that they wouldn't be counted in the calculation of dropout, or excuse me, of the graduation rate. And what I want to show in this slide is that, in fact, in addition to the fact that this has been audited heavily by Ernst & Young and others to verify the fact that students who are dropouts are in fact dropping out of high school, students who are transferring out of the system are in fact transferring out, and the Independent Budget Office has also done its own analysis of the transfer and dropout question. But in addition to that, this graph shows you that the transfer and dropout rates are actually decreasing over time, which is also a signal that young people who are typically at high risk of dropping out or staying or transferring out of the school system are continuing and increasingly included in the graduation rate, which under other circumstances might drive those graduation rates down. In spite of that, we still see significant increases in the graduation rate. So I think one big question that this raises, is this a middle school phenomenon or is this a high school phenomenon? Are students better prepared coming into high school and then subsequently more likely to graduate, or are the high schools doing a better job with the students as they receive them? I think our analysis so far, although it's largely descriptive, suggests that it's a combination of both. We do see significant increases, for example, in student attendance rates and in their achievement test scores in English language arts and math. At the same time, for students who start off in the bottom of the distribution of test scores or graduation rates, we see the largest improvements in graduation rates and college readiness among the students who are starting off further down in the distribution of their incoming performance and engagement characteristics. And so what that looks like here is first looking at the 8th grade test scores of entering 9th graders. And these are the New York State proficiency, percentage of students who are meeting the New York State proficiency standards in English language arts, represented in the blue bar, and in math in the yellow bar. And we see consistent improvement in the percentage of students who are identified as proficient, scoring at level 3 or level 4 on their English language arts or math achievement results. You'll see a precipitous drop in 2010, which was the year in which the New York State Regents redefined the cut score that was required for students to be classified as level 3 or level 4. So they did not change the test. They did not change student performance overnight. They simply redrew the line for what it meant for a student to be proficient at level 3 or level 4, and we see that drop. Yet I think one thing is interesting to note is that the proficiency levels, even at that higher standard, are as high or higher than they were in 2006, as recently as 2006. So I think this marks some fairly steady improvement. But I think when we look at the graduation rates or college readiness, credit accumulation, attendance rates in high school, it's important to account, A, for the variation in the improvement in student performance over time, but also this variation in the way that proficiency gets counted. So in order to control for that in part, what we've looked at is the graduation rates, for example, the Regents diploma receipt rates among students who scored in the bottom 20% of test scores, regardless of what the proficiency standard was. So this 20% is a higher and higher achieving group of students over time, but they still rank in the bottom 20% of all students coming into high schools in the respective years represented in our sample. And the students at the top are in the top 20% in English language arts or math. And in order to control for the differences in test scores between math and English language arts, we wanted to make sure that if you had, for example, an English language arts score in the bottom of the bottom 20%, that your math score couldn't be any higher than the 50th percentile. Okay, so that's just a way that we constructed these groups. But the point of this graph is to show first and foremost that the improvements in Regents diploma receipt rate, so this is showing you the percentage of young people who earned a Regents diploma within the 4 years that they were in a New York City high school, improved in all points of the distribution of test scores, and that the largest gains were realized by young people in the bottom or the middle parts of the distribution of both test scores and attendance rates. At the same time, I think it's important to note that performance in the 8th grade is still a pretty strong predictor of how you're going to do in terms of earning a Regents diploma. And we'll see in the next graph, it's an even stronger predictor of the likelihood that you'll complete high school not just with a Regents diploma, but with this aspirational performance measure as well. Again, we see a pretty solid improvement among students in the middle and the top part of the distribution of test scores and attendance rates. But if you haven't scored in the top 20%, your probability of being college ready according to this aspirational performance measures are very, very slight. And in fact, students scoring in the bottom 20%, so far, the percentage of young people graduating college ready is extreme, I mean zero. I mean, these are virtually zero numbers. And in the middle, you're still 4 times less likely, or 5 times less likely to be college ready at the end of high school in that middle 60%. So that's 80% of the distribution of test scores we see young people having very limited prospects for being college ready, even with the improvements that we've seen. I'm going to move a little more quickly through the demographic and the race and ethnic breakdowns here. All of this stuff is in the paper, but I think the key here again is to say that we see the strongest gains in Regents diploma receipt rates and in college readiness among Black and Latino young people, especially Black and Latino young men. low-income students, students identified for English language learning students, and students with special education designations. And in this case here, we're talking about not students in self-contained classrooms or in self-contained schools, but students who are in related services, so that it's a less disabled population of young people than the full system might indicate. And we can go into why we included that. But significant gaps remain. So let me show you what that looks like. So we see again with the yellow bars indicating the 2001 cohort and the blue bars representing the 2007 cohort, the differences between those to show you the gains and the improvements over time in Regents diploma receipt rates. Yet if you compare, let's take a look at the right-hand side where we look at young men. We see that Black and Latino young men are still remain far behind their white and Asian counterparts, although the gap has closed somewhat. In 2001, Black and Latino young men were about 2.5 times less likely to earn a Regents diploma. By 2007, that's down to about 1.7 times less likely. The rates for college readiness are even more dramatic, however. We see, again, I think the rate at which young men of color are earning a college-ready credential almost doubling or more than doubling, yet that still gets them to 10% or fewer compared to their white and Asian counterparts who are well above, or at or above 40%. Similar patterns when we look at young people who enter high school over age for grade. That's usually a signal that students have been retained in a prior grade. For students who are eligible for free or reduced price lunch, represented here in the lower SES category. Students whose home language is not English, that's what the English not English is signifying. Students who are identified for English language learning services compared to those who aren't, and students who are referred for related special education services compared to those who aren't. And again, the gains seem to accrue more quickly, and the growth seems to be steeper both in graduation rates and in college-ready rates. So let me sum up with two sort of forward-looking points. One, I think there's one big question is, so what's behind these numbers? What's sort of driving these numbers? This report doesn't take that on directly, but other research has. Research by MDRC, research by the Institute on Education and Social Policy at NYU has looked pretty rigorously at the impact that small schools are having on a range of these indicators. And they find, I think, pretty compelling evidence. The MDRC study in particular, which is among the most rigorous studies ever done of a system-wide reform effort, shows substantial improvements in student outcomes, in a wide range of student outcomes based on this rigorous analysis. And the work by Amy Ellen Schwartz and her colleagues at the Institute of Education and Social Policy have found similar things. And they've actually looked much more widely than MDRC at the full range of small schools, compared them with larger schools. They see, just like we do, I think, impressive gains across the board on large schools, small schools, but they see the largest gains accruing to young people who end up in some of these small schools of choice. I think policy-wise, there's probably sort of a broad three-pronged approach to future policy. One is sort of a sustaining the gains and trying to mark and continue the improvements that have gotten more and more young people to earn a Regents diploma, but recognizing that the Regents diploma is becoming less and less, more and more necessary, but less and less sufficient as a credential that will help young people make healthy transitions to adulthood. We'll have to continue to work on aligning standards and curricula and instructional approaches with the skills they'll need to succeed in college. Again, I think referring to the Common Core is really taking that question on directly. And then finally, we continue to see these gaps. So an approach that offers multiple high-quality pathways, committing ourselves more to both to equity with excellence, with high-quality multiple pathways that will get young people not just into the world of higher education, but into the world of work as well. And as I said at the outset, I think this set of analyses raises at least as many questions, if not more, than it answers. And among those, I think, is to try to get behind these averages. As I said, the original intent of this was to really set the stage for more sophisticated and more rigorous analysis of other questions. And we want to know more about what are the characteristics that raise achievement, and of schools that raise achievement and close gaps at the same time. Is this an all ships rising, or are some places getting more traction by beating the odds with young people who enter high school with characteristics that are typically associated with a risk of failing? I think we want to try to continue to look at the impact of particular policies. And I think we also want to try to understand more about what's going on at the system level with things like the mandatory school-wide choice. And we want to understand a bit more about what's been transpiring with the effort to phase out the lowest performing schools. Let me stop there and leave you all a little breathless, or at least as breathless as I've been over the last few weeks. Thank you. And this will be posted tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., so go to our website. The shortcut to that is just ranix.org.
So thank you, Jim. I can't imagine anyone getting through more material in less time. Extraordinary. Let me begin by introducing the gentleman on my left. On my far left, Jeff Henning is Professor of Political Science and Education and Chair of the Department of Education Policy and Social Analysis at Teachers College Columbia. And Shail Sharansky is Chief Academic Officer and Senior Deputy Chancellor for Performance and Accountability at the New York City Department of Education. I have a vivid memory of when that work started. Let me begin by offering a few remarks of my own. I'm going to ask Shail and Jeff then also to speak for just 5 to 7 minutes. I'll then pose a few questions to my three guests and then open it up to the floor for some time for questions. Let me begin by saying, of course, there are going to be and should be some tough questions here. To begin with, as many of you know, the NAEP results from 2011 to 2013 for the city were essentially flat, as they were for the nation. But there were no great increases. So it was also with SAT scores, where it has to be said more students were taking the SAT in New York City, including minorities. But again, the results were very parallel to the nation, essentially flat for all subgroups. So if we've got NAEP and SAT with essentially flat results, there is a question of what it is we're seeing here when we talk about major improvements, particularly in the last couple of years. So that's one set of sort of external questions we'll want to pose. Second set of questions go to issues that all of you are familiar with, questions about credit recovery, questions about the grading of the Regents exams and changes that my successor, John King, is making in terms of teachers no longer grading their own students' Regents exams. I have to say that compared with the NAEP SAT questions, I find those myself less disturbing because they are relative. In other words, they're the same for everyone in the state, and therefore the ratios of improvement wouldn't change that much, even if it turns out that we get a dip, for example, in Regents scores once we have teachers not scoring their own tests. And we don't know whether that indeed will happen or not. But there are, of course, questions, and fully legitimate ones, about issues of that kind. I think there is a final question about the Regents exam itself, which will be answered one way or another as the state, along with 46 other states in ELA and 45 states in mathematics, shift to the new assessments that are Common Core aligned. And the whole question of what will we see when that happens, and the very difficult set of issues that the Board of Regents, and we have a regent with us this evening, but the Board of Regents will have to struggle with as to where the cut score and the graduation rate will come with those new tests. That'll be a whole new can of worms. But I want to close by saying something a little more theoretical. It is very difficult for this country to hear any good news about education. It is much easier in some ways to report bad news. Bad news is much more interesting to the press. Bad news is more dramatic. It's just human nature, perhaps. Bad news confirms personal experiences where those experiences have been troubling for one legitimate reason or another. And we're very used to it. And I remember the difficulty, for example, of resetting the cut scores that you spoke of, and our long story about that and why we felt we had to do it. But while we had some very serious questions to answer, rightly, about what had gone on at the state and why we were resetting the scores, the only group that seemed only too pleased to gobble that up were those who always loved bad news. And so we have a paradox here in a way.